In this video, I make a bandsaw box, and I added a little music player in it. I started off with a piece of this. It's actually I was going through my firewood pile, and I found this, and it was split, but not all the way through, so I thought it would work good. So I was kind of just going through and trying to cut off some of the splits to see actually how deep it did go. I was just taking my time and using the fence to try to square it up a little bit and get a nicer cut than what the chainsaw left on this piece of wood. I think this wood was sitting out for at least one whole year, maybe a little longer. So then I sped it up here, and I'm just going through and trying to get it squared up a little bit. I like it's not really bark, but I like the grain a lot, and then you can see that's what I was looking at, but the way that top is really nice, I thought. And I'm just squaring more up a little bit. To get off that side there that was split, I just freehanded that. I just kept going around it until I got it squared up where I wanted it. I'm thinking this was 3 or 5x speed here. I sped up most of this video. You can see I put some super glue in the cracks. I do that on wood turning, and I don't think I would do it again for this type of project. I don't think it added much, and wood turning will keep it from splitting out and splintering more. I just roughly drew out on here. I used just a paint can lid to get a kind of circle of where I wanted to cut out. Just kind of getting the shape and experimenting with it. Just trying to get an idea of the size of it. I won't be cutting in all these lines, but it's just to gauge it. So I started off by cutting off the back of it. And that's typically how like a bandsaw box works. Cut the back off, and then later on I'll glue it back on. Important thing in making these is not to mix up the pieces. And you can see a little chip came off of it there, which was kind of a bummer, but I'll show you how I dealt with that later on. Could have glued it back on, but I decided not to. I sped up the video again. So actually, I cut into the bottom here, and I'll be taking this center part out now, with only having one slice in it so that it could be glued back together and not show much, if any, of a seam. And this would have been easier with a thinner blade, but I may do with what I had on it. This is actually the only blade. Well, I had a couple blades, but they're all the same thicknesses, or well, I guess it's widths. I now have some different blades for this bandsaw. This is the first project I did on this bandsaw, so kind of why I inspired to do it. And then the tricky part's just getting everything out. luckily I had enough clearance to raise it up and slide it all out. So you can see that crack on the other side, it did break all the way through. That's kind of the gist of it there. Now I glued this up, see where it came completely apart, and I put a ton of glue on it. I stuck to my normal, used more glue than needed. Clamped it up really well so that there wasn't a gap that would be very visible there. And I'm just worried about this one cut right now, this one spot, and I did the other side later on. But typically when you make a bandsaw box, you only have the one thing to glue. So, well, this is where I glue the back on. Now, I didn't sand, and I'm wishing I would have sanded the everything right now, actually, and I think it would have made a lot less visible the cut where the slice is in this. Some of it was camouflage because of all that texture at the top of it, but it just would have been, I think, a lot nicer if I would have sanded it. The next one I do, I am going to sand it. I'm going to sand the inside of it too at this point, because I think it'd be easier without having sides on it, or front and back, I guess. But my thought at the time was, well, I'll just glue it all together and I'll sand it at the end, but that proved a little bit more difficult. So the key is to get it clamped up really tight, and then I wiped off the glue. You see, I ended up not using clamp in the middle like that. I used a couple boards. But there, I wiped off the glue, some of it. So there I go to some boards, and then I used a wet paper towel to get the glue off of it as much as I could, because I knew I wouldn't be able to sand really well with that texture there. So this is the inside box itself, and this one's a little bit different because I wanted to put a music box player into it that came out of I believe a snow globe that the kids had broke, and they were playing with it and they wanted to have something else with it. And also I had that exposed piece of wood grain there that I didn't want to basically take out of I wanted to leave that. So normally in a bandsaw box you would not cut it quite like that. I'm just drawing out where I want things to be. Try not to get into where it's split too much to leave some strength and rigidity to it. And that's why that's curved versus just coming down straight like the other side. And that's kind of where it gets hard, so just chipped away at it. I have this part of the video sped up, it wasn't this fast. Yep, just kept going until I got the bottom where I liked it. And that's what the box is kind of going to look like. So this is where I'm kind of getting a feel of where the little snow globe music player is going to go. And I did some testing with it to see how the sound actually worked on those, and if there's something behind them, the sound was much better. It was clearer and a little bit louder, which louder, as a parent, didn't really care for, but the clearer I thought was kind of neat. So, but it's not too noisy. There's no batteries in it, so it's not like a lot of these battery operated toys. So So the next part was trying to figure out, just rough it out, and then I needed to mill out kind of that area now. So I started by cutting the straight parts I could on the bandsaw. Careful to count your fingers before and after. I'm sure it would take them off pretty quick. But I just kept edging away, inching up on it. And then I should have done this on a bench, but luckily I didn't get to the table. But I just decided, since I was on the bandsaw, just to use the bandsaw as my workbench there. My woodworking bench had a bunch of stuff piled on it, is the reason why. But I just, with the chisel and then that, and luckily I didn't damage the table on my bandsaw. It's definitely not advisable to do it on that. But just kept going away at it and used the chisel to clean it up. So this is actually in a drill mill, and you can see there's a lot of chatter there. I had a hard time clamping that down in the vise even. I went through and pre-drilled it, and then I went through and hit it with a Forstner bit, and now I'm trying to clean up a little bit with the chisel, and you can see that it's just too thin right there and cracked. I had to get it that thin so that the winding piece would stick through. It didn't have much. So I decided just to go with that and open it up even more. I did some tests by holding the music player, and I still had enough of a back that it sounded good. And once again, I did not sand, and I should have. I'm wishing I would have sanded it all. I think that would make a difference, is getting everything sanded before I'd clean up a little bit. Just because it's a pretty clean cut, but would have been even cleaner. So then I went through and sanded up everything afterwards, which worked out okay. And that's where that chip was gone, so I was just going to round off that side. I started by cutting it off on the bandsaw, since that was quicker than trying to sand away that much material. And then I later put it on a belt sander and sand it off. And I'm sanding everything by hand to try to get a nicer finish. Careful not to go over where the wood, I guess the bark type thing, and the exposed side of the wood is. That weathered piece of it. So this is just another piece I've cut off of that. And I'm trying to square it up just a little bit. And I put it in my wood lathe, and you can see my tool post isn't very tight there. And started turning it down. And the whole idea here is to make a little knob or handle. I guess it is a knob. And my tool post is wiggling a lot on me there. But this is for the drawer piece of it. I wanted it to be out of the same piece of wood, so that looked pretty neat. And I just keep checking on it just to see how it's doing. It's been a while since I used the wood lathe. I've been using a lot more of the metal lathe, so it's definitely you're turning things, but definitely different technique and tools, and a person kind of needs to do this every once in a while just so they don't get rusty. And they probably need to sharpen these tools too, because they weren't putting that great of a finish on, and I can't remember the last time I sharpened them, so I got some chisels I need to sharpen too, so maybe that's something I should work on. That's some emery cloth that I love sanding on the wood lathe. It's so cool. It's so fast too. And that's just a foam block to kind of get some texture. And then I went over with some finer sandpaper, but it still had a little bit of roughness, but not too bad. It's just going to drop off here, and yep. And I sanded up that little nub it left. And for this, I just super glued it on. Wood glue works just as good, maybe even a little better. But it's held up with the kids playing with it, so. And then I'm using some of that fake tung oil on this just because I want to use that up. And I thought it'd be a good finish for this since I think the kids are just going to be rough on it. And I put it on thick. I'm just dumping it in and on and rubbing it. I wanted to get it nice and oiled up there. I didn't want to stain it or take away from it. And you can see that glue line. I think a lot of that would have disappeared if I had sanded before I glued it. I think part of that's just the blade curve and the little bit of roughness from the blade. I think I could have used less glue, or I would have squished out better maybe too. But for the first one, it wasn't too bad. This is my first time trying to finish like a natural wood. I don't know, it's not really natural, but unsanded wood, I should say, like bark type wood. Um, but I think it kind of blended in well, I guess. And I decided to wax the bottom of the drawer so that it slid better. And I think I waxed the whole drawer there, yeah. Help protect it a little more too. Became fond of paste wax. There it is. Thanks for watching.